It was 1994, and Hollywood was about to witness something special. Not just another action movie, but the beginning of a connection that would last for decades. Keanu Reeves walked onto the set of Speed with his usual quiet demeanor. He was already known in Hollywood, but he hadn't yet become the superstar the world would later adore. Sandra Bullock arrived with her bright smile and down-to-earth personality. She was still climbing the ladder of success, hungry to prove herself in an industry that wasn't always kind to women. The first day of shooting was intense. The movie was about a bus that couldn't slow down, filled with passengers whose lives hung in the balance. But what nobody expected was the instant spark between the two lead actors. It wasn't the kind of chemistry you could fake or manufacture. It was real, and everyone on set could feel it. Between takes, Keanu would make Sandra laugh with his dry sense of humor. She'd tease him right back, and he'd respond with that signature half-smile of his. The director noticed it immediately. This wasn't acting anymore. This was two people who genuinely enjoyed being around each other. The camera loved them together, and audiences would soon feel that same magic. Sandra later remembered thinking Keanu was different from other actors she'd worked with. He didn't have the big ego that often came with Hollywood success. When she'd mess up a line, he'd reassure her instead of getting frustrated. When the stunts got dangerous, he'd check on her before worrying about himself. These small gestures meant everything to her. Keanu found himself drawn to Sandra's authenticity. In a town full of pretense, she was refreshingly real. She'd show up to set without an entourage, crack jokes with the crew, and treat everyone with the same respect regardless of their position. He admired that. He admired her. The weeks of filming turned into months, and their friendship deepened. They'd grab coffee before early morning shoots. They'd rehearse lines together long after everyone else had gone home. Sometimes they'd just sit in comfortable silence, the kind of silence that only exists between people who truly understand each other. There was one particular scene that became legendary among the crew. It was a quiet moment in the film where their characters really connected. The director called action, but what happened next wasn't entirely in the script. The way Keanu looked at Sandra, the way she responded, the electricity between them was so genuine that everyone watching held their breath. When the director finally called cut, there was a moment of stunned silence before the crew burst into applause. Sandra felt something shift in that moment. This wasn't just a professional partnership anymore. She was developing feelings, real feelings for her co-star, but she kept them to herself. Keanu was kind to everyone. Maybe she was reading too much into his gentle nature. Maybe he was just being a good scene partner. She convinced herself not to risk their budding friendship by revealing her crush. Keanu, on his part, was fighting his own internal battle. He found Sandra incredibly attractive, not just physically but in every way that mattered. Her laugh, her kindness, her talent, the way she made him feel comfortable being himself. But he was shy when it came to romance. He'd been hurt before, and Sandra seemed so confident, so successful. Surely she wouldn't be interested in someone like him. He decided to cherish their friendship, rather than risk ruining it with unwanted romantic attention. The cast and crew started placing bets on when the two would finally get together. It seemed inevitable to everyone watching. The way they'd lean toward each other during conversations, the way their hands would almost touch and then pull away, the lingering looks when they thought no one was watching. It was like watching a love story unfold in real time, except the two main characters seemed completely oblivious to what was obvious to everyone else. During breaks, they'd explore Los Angeles together. Sandra would take Keanu to her favorite coffee shops. He'd show her quiet spots in the city where they could escape the chaos of their growing fame. These weren't dates, they told themselves. Just friends hanging out. But there was always something more simmering beneath the surface, unspoken but undeniable. One evening after a particularly exhausting day of filming, they sat together watching the sunset. Sandra almost said something. The words were right there, ready to spill out. But Keanu spoke first, talking about how grateful he was for their friendship, how rare it was to find someone so easy to work with. She swallowed her confession and agreed. Yes, their friendship was special. She wouldn't risk it. As Speed wrapped up filming, both felt a sense of loss. They'd see each other again at premieres and press events, but it wouldn't be the same as these daily interactions. They exchanged numbers and promised to stay in touch. It was a promise they would actually keep, unlike most Hollywood friendships that fade once the cameras stop rolling. The movie premiered in the summer of 1994 and became a massive hit. Critics praised the non-stop action, but they especially noted the incredible chemistry between the leads. Audiences agreed. People left theaters talking about how perfect Keanu and Sandra were together. Interviewers would ask them about it, and they'd both smile and say they were just good friends. Really good friends. But late at night, alone in their respective homes, both would sometimes wonder what if. What if one of them had been brave enough to say something? What if the timing had been different? What if they'd taken that risk? They didn't know it then, but this was just the beginning of their story. Not a romance in the traditional sense, but something perhaps even more rare. A connection that would survive decades, heartbreaks, triumphs, and everything life would throw at them. The seeds planted during those months filming Speed would grow into something neither of them could have predicted. A bond that would define what it truly means to love someone. As they went their separate ways after that last day of filming, neither could have imagined they'd still be in each other's lives 30 years later. Still making each other laugh, still being there for each other through everything. The bus might have stopped, but their story was just beginning. The years after Speed were like watching two rockets launch in different directions, both soaring but never quite crossing paths at the right moment. Keanu's career exploded with The Matrix trilogy, turning him into a global action icon. Sandra became America's sweetheart, winning hearts in romantic comedies and proving her dramatic range in films that earned her critical acclaim. They were both at the top of their game, but success in Hollywood often comes with a price. They kept in touch just like they'd promised. Not every day, but enough. A phone call here, a text message there. Keanu would send flowers to Sandra's movie premieres. She'd call him after his films opened, always with genuine excitement about his success. These weren't obligatory Hollywood gestures. These were the actions of two people who truly cared about each other's happiness. Sandra dated, as people do. She was linked to various actors and musicians over the years. Each time Keanu heard about a new relationship, he'd feel something twist in his chest. He told himself he was just being protective like a brother would be. But late at night, he'd admit to himself that it was more than that. He'd wonder what might have been if he'd been braver back in 1994. Keanu kept his personal life private, as he always had. But those close to him knew there was someone special in his life. In 1999, his girlfriend became pregnant with their daughter. He was going to be a father. For a brief moment, life seemed to be falling into place. Sandra sent him a heartfelt message when she heard the news. Genuinely happy for him, even as her own heart felt a strange pang she couldn't quite explain. Then tragedy struck in a way that would change Keanu forever. His daughter was stillborn in December 1999. The grief was overwhelming, incomprehensible. Sandra was one of the first people to reach out. She didn't try to say the right thing because there were no right words. She just let him know she was there whenever he needed her, for whatever he needed. The pain got worse. Keanu's girlfriend, struggling with her own grief and depression, died in a car accident in 2001. In the span of 2 years, Keanu had lost both his daughter and his partner. He retreated from the world, and most people respected his need for privacy. But Sandra didn't let him disappear completely. She'd check in regularly, never pushing, never demanding his attention, just reminding him that he wasn't alone. During this dark period, Keanu realized something profound about Sandra. She wasn't there for him because of who he was in Hollywood. She was there because of who he was as a person. Her care wasn't performative or motivated by publicity. It was genuine, unconditional, the kind of love that asks for nothing in return. It was exactly what he needed, even if he couldn't fully express his gratitude at the time. Sandra went through her own relationship struggles. She got married in 2005, hoping to build the family life she'd always wanted. From the outside, everything looked perfect. But the reality was far more complicated. When things started falling apart, when she felt lost and confused about her own life choices, Keanu was there. He'd listen without judgment, offer support without trying to fix everything, and remind her of her own strength when she'd forgotten it. In 2006, they reunited professionally for The Lake House. 12 years had passed since Speed, and both had lived entire lifetimes in that span. Walking onto set together again felt like coming home. The crew noticed immediately that something special existed between them. That same easy chemistry, that same genuine affection, but now deepened by years of friendship and shared experiences. During filming, they'd talk for hours between scenes. About life, loss, love, and everything they'd been through. Keanu was more open than he'd ever been, and Sandra felt safe sharing things she rarely discussed with anyone. They'd both grown, both been broken and rebuilt, and somehow their connection had only gotten stronger. One particular evening during production, they went to dinner after a long day of shooting. The conversation turned to relationships and timing. Sandra mentioned how strange it was that they'd never dated, given how well they got along. Keanu smiled that enigmatic smile of his and said something about how maybe some connections were too important to risk on romance. Sandra agreed, but both wondered if they were just protecting themselves from potential heartbreak. The truth was, they were both scared. Scared of ruining what they had. Scared that real life wouldn't live up to the possibility. Scared that if it didn't work out, they'd lose each other completely. So they stayed in this comfortable space of what-ifs and maybes, neither willing to be the one who pushed things forward. Sandra's marriage ended in 2010, a painful and very public divorce. The details were tabloid fodder for months. Through it all, Keanu was her rock. He'd show up at her house with food when he knew she wasn't eating. He'd send her silly texts to make her laugh when he knew she was crying. He asked nothing of her except that she take care of herself. She leaned on him in ways she hadn't leaned on anyone before. And she realized something that both comforted and confused her. Keanu had been more present, more supportive, more loving than her actual husband had been. He showed up consistently, without fanfare, without expecting anything in return. That's when it hit her. She'd been looking for love in all the wrong places when one of the most profound loves of her life had been right there all along. But it wasn't romantic love, not anymore. Or maybe it was, but it had transformed into something different, something she couldn't quite name. It was deeper than friendship, but different from romance. It was a love that existed in its own category, undefined by conventional labels. Keanu felt it too. Watching Sandra go through her divorce, being there for her, he understood that what they had transcended typical relationship categories. He loved her, absolutely, but acting on that love romantically felt like it would diminish something, rather than enhance it. They'd built something rare, something that had survived time and distance and life's cruelties. Why risk that for the uncertainty of romance? Years continued to pass. They'd see each other at industry events, always gravitating toward each other in crowded rooms. They'd celebrate each other's successes and mourn each other's losses. When Sandra adopted her first child, Keanu was one of the first people she told. When Keanu started his motorcycle company, Sandra was his biggest cheerleader. Interviewers would still ask about their relationship. Were they dating? Had they ever dated? Why not? The questions never stopped because the public could see what they saw. Two people who clearly adored each other, who had undeniable chemistry, who seemed perfect together. Both Keanu and Sandra got good at deflecting these questions with humor and grace, but in private moments they'd acknowledge it to each other. Yes, there had been feelings. Yes, the timing was never right. Yes, they'd both wondered what if. But they'd also built something that most people never find in a lifetime. A love that wasn't complicated by possession or expectation. A connection that didn't demand anything except mutual respect and genuine care. Sandra once told a close friend that Keanu was her person. Not her boyfriend, not her husband, but her person. The one who knew her completely and loved her anyway. The one whose opinion mattered most. The one whose presence made everything better. Her friend asked if that wasn't just another way of describing a soulmate. Sandra smiled and said maybe it was. Keanu, in his quiet way, felt the same. Sandra represented everything good in his life. She was proof that genuine connection existed, that loyalty meant something, that love didn't have to be complicated or demanding. She was his safe place, his constant, his reminder that even in Hollywood's chaos, real relationships could survive. As they both entered their 50s, this unspoken understanding between them felt more precious than ever. They'd watched friends and colleagues cycle through relationships, always chasing the next thing, always looking for something more. But Keanu and Sandra had found something that didn't need to be more than it was. It was already everything. Time has a funny way of revealing truths we weren't ready to see when we were younger. As Keanu moved through his 50s, he started reflecting more on his life, his choices, and the people who mattered most. Sandra was always at the top of that list. But it wasn't until both of them had enough life experience, enough heartbreak and healing, that they could really understand what they meant to each other. Hollywood had changed around them. New stars rose and fell. Social media transformed how celebrities connected with fans. But through it all, Keanu and Sandra remained constants in each other's lives, their bond somehow untouched by the industry's chaos. They'd both learned that fame was fleeting, that success could disappear overnight, but real relationships, the ones built on genuine connection, those were forever. Sandra adopted her second child, and Keanu was there for that journey too. He understood her desire to be a mother, to build a family on her own terms. He never judged her choices or questioned her decisions. He simply supported her, showing up when she needed him and giving her space when she needed that too. This balance, this intuitive understanding of what the other person needed, was something they'd perfected over decades. Keanu started his own family journey too, finding love again with Alexandra, an artist who understood his need for privacy and his deep capacity for loyalty. Sandra was genuinely happy for him. There was no jealousy, no possessiveness, just pure happiness that he'd found someone who made him smile again. She'd meet Alexandra and immediately understand why Keanu was drawn to her. She was kind, creative, and respected the friendships Keanu had built over his lifetime, including his special bond with Sandra. The internet became obsessed with Keanu during this period. Memes about his kindness circulated widely. Stories of his generosity and humility went viral. People called him the internet's boyfriend, praised him as the last good person in Hollywood. Through it all, Keanu remained uncomfortable with the attention. Sandra would tease him about it, sending him the funniest memes and articles. He'd laugh and shake his head, grateful that she kept him grounded and didn't treat him any differently despite the world's obsession. They'd still talk regularly, though both their lives were busier than ever. Sometimes months would pass between in-person meetings, but the connection never weakened. They'd pick up exactly where they left off. No awkwardness, no need to catch up on every detail. They just understood each other in that effortless way that comes from decades of friendship. Sandra went through some tough years dealing with her own health, scares, and the challenges of raising children in the spotlight. Keanu was her safe person to vent to, the one who'd listen without trying to solve everything, who'd just be present with her in her worry and fear. When things got better, he was the first person she'd want to celebrate with, the one whose opinion on her life choices mattered most. They both started to notice something interesting as they got older. Younger actors would ask them for advice about navigating Hollywood, about staying grounded, about maintaining real relationships in a fake industry. Both Keanu and Sandra would often reference each other in these conversations. They'd become living proof that authentic connection was possible, that you could be successful without losing yourself. That loyalty and kindness weren't weaknesses, but strengths. There were moments when the what-ifs would resurface. Sandra would watch Keanu with Alexandra and think about how different her life might have been if she'd been brave enough to tell him how she felt back in 1994. Keanu would see Sandra with her children and wonder if they might have built that life together if the timing had been different. But these thoughts didn't come with regret anymore. Just a gentle curiosity about alternate timelines. The truth was, they'd each had to go through everything they went through to become the people they were now. The losses, the heartbreaks, the victories, the failures, all of it had shaped them. And maybe, just maybe, their relationship had remained strong precisely because it hadn't followed the traditional romantic path. Maybe trying to force it into that box would have destroyed something that was meant to exist in its own unique space. Interviewers still asked the question that never got old to the public. What was really going on between them? Were they sure they never dated? In 2018, Sandra finally opened up a bit more. She admitted on a talk show that she'd had a crush on Keanu during Speed. The revelation went viral immediately. People couldn't believe it. The confession they'd all been waiting for was finally out there. Keanu heard about it and smiled that knowing smile of his. He wasn't surprised she'd finally said something. What surprised him was his own reaction. Instead of feeling regret or loss, he felt grateful. Grateful that she'd felt something. Grateful that he wasn't alone in those feelings. Grateful that despite not acting on them, they'd built something even more lasting. A few weeks later, in his own interview, Keanu responded. He admitted he'd been attracted to Sandra too, that he'd thought she was amazing but had been too shy to make a move. The internet exploded. Here were two beloved celebrities finally confirming what everyone had suspected for 25 years. The missed connection, the mutual attraction, the what could have been of it all captured everyone's imagination. But what got lost in the frenzy was the more important part of what they both said. Yes, there had been attraction. Yes, the timing was never right. But what they'd built instead was something they both treasured more than any romance could have been. They'd become each other's constants, each other's safe places, each other's proof that love came in many forms and didn't need to fit into society's predetermined boxes. Sandra talked about how Keanu would show up at her house unannounced with champagne and truffles because he'd remembered her mentioning once that she'd never tried them. He'd come over on his motorcycle, share them with her, and leave. No expectation, no ulterior motive, just a friend doing something kind because he could. These small gestures, repeated over decades, meant more to her than any grand romantic gesture ever could. Keanu shared stories too, about how Sandra would check in on him during hard times, how she'd send him books she thought he'd like, how she made him feel seen and understood in a way that was rare and precious. He talked about how her opinion on his work mattered more than any critic's review, how her approval made successes sweeter and failures easier to bear. Their public confessions didn't change their relationship, but it did change how the world viewed them. People started to see what they represented as something aspirational, not a missed romantic opportunity, but a successful navigation of complex feelings into a lasting, meaningful connection. They became symbols of emotional maturity, of love that transcended traditional categories. Some people couldn't understand it. They'd comment on articles and social media posts saying they should just get together already, that they were wasting time, that they were meant to be. But those who really paid attention, who really listened to what Keanu and Sandra were saying, understood something profound. They had gotten together, just not in the way people expected. They'd created a relationship that worked for them, one that had survived everything life threw at them. As they both approached their 60s, this understanding became even clearer. They'd outlasted most Hollywood friendships, most Hollywood marriages, most Hollywood anything. What they had was real in a way that was increasingly rare. They didn't need to explain it or justify it or change it to fit other people's expectations. It simply was, and that was enough. Sandra would sometimes joke with friends that Keanu was the love of her life, just not in the conventional way. Her friends would nod, understanding what she meant. He was her person, her constant, her proof that real love existed. It just looked different than what movies and songs had told them love should look like. Keanu felt the same way. Sandra represented home to him, not a physical place, but a feeling. Being around her, talking to her, knowing she was in his life, that was home. It was safety and understanding and acceptance all rolled into one person. He didn't need to be anything other than himself with her, and that freedom was priceless. The years kept passing, and their friendship kept deepening. They weren't just surviving Hollywood together anymore. They were thriving, separately but connected, building their own lives while maintaining this unbreakable bond. And as Keanu's 60th birthday approached, he started thinking about legacy, about what mattered, about what he wanted people to know about his life and the people who'd shaped it. Turning 60 changes something in a person. It's not just about getting older or marking another milestone. It's about looking back at the journey and finally understanding what really mattered along the way. For Keanu, approaching this birthday meant reflecting on the relationships that had defined his life. And Sandra was at the center of those reflections. He'd always been private, famously so. While other celebrities shared every detail of their lives on social media, Keanu remained an enigma. He did his work, treated people with respect, and kept his personal life personal. But something was shifting inside him. Maybe it was the accumulation of decades of keeping certain truths close to his chest. Maybe it was watching the world change and feeling like authentic stories mattered more than ever. Whatever the reason, Keanu decided it was time to open up in a way he never had before. The interview happened almost by accident. He'd agreed to talk about his latest project, but the conversation naturally drifted to broader topics about life, love, and legacy. The interviewer was skilled, creating a comfortable space where Keanu felt safe being more vulnerable than usual. When the questions turned to relationships and meaningful connections, Keanu found himself talking about Sandra in a way he never had publicly. He started by acknowledging what everyone had always suspected. Yes, he'd had feelings for her during Speed. He described being a younger man, unsure of himself despite his success, completely enamored with this brilliant, beautiful woman but too afraid to do anything about it. He talked about watching her between takes, noticing how kind she was to everyone on set, how her laugh could light up the entire room. But what came next was what really captured people's hearts. Keanu didn't just talk about old feelings or missed opportunities. He talked about what Sandra had meant to his life across 3 decades. He spoke about how she'd been there during his darkest moments, after losing his daughter and his partner, when the world felt impossible to navigate. He described her presence as a lifeline, not dramatic or demanding, just steady and true. His voice got softer when he talked about the small things. How Sandra would check in on him not just during crises but on random Tuesdays. How she'd remember details about his life that even he sometimes forgot. How she'd call him out when he was being too hard on himself, and lift him up when he needed encouragement. These weren't grand gestures, but they'd accumulated over the years into something profound. Keanu used a word that surprised the interviewer, and would later resonate with millions. He called Sandra his soulmate. But he quickly clarified what he meant by that. Not in the romantic comedy sense where soulmates were destined to be together romantically, but in the truest sense of the word, someone whose soul understood his soul, who saw him completely and chose to stay anyway. He talked about how society had limited definitions of love, how we were taught that the most important love had to be romantic love, but his relationship with Sandra had taught him that love was bigger than that, more complex, more beautiful in its various forms. What they had was love, pure and simple, just not the kind that came with traditional labels. The interviewer asked the question that everyone wanted answered. Did he regret not pursuing a romantic relationship with her? Keanu paused for a long time before answering, choosing his words carefully. He said that regret implied wishing things had been different, and he didn't wish that. Yes, there had been attraction. Yes, there had been feelings. But if they'd dated and it hadn't worked out, he might have lost her completely, and losing Sandra from his life was unthinkable. He explained that what they'd built was rare, maybe rarer than romantic love. How many people could say they'd maintained a deep, meaningful connection with someone for 30 years? How many Hollywood friendships survived that long? That genuinely, they'd created something that worked for them, something that had weathered time and change and all of life's complications. Why would he regret that? The interview was posted online and went viral within hours. People were moved by Keanu's honesty, his vulnerability, his willingness to challenge conventional ideas about love and relationships. Comments flooded in from people sharing their own stories of important relationships that didn't fit traditional molds. Keanu had touched something universal, a truth that many people felt but rarely heard articulated so clearly. Sandra saw the interview the same day it dropped. She watched it alone, tears streaming down her face. Not sad tears, but tears of recognition and gratitude. Everything Keanu said resonated with her own feelings, her own experience of their relationship. She'd always known how much she meant to him, but hearing him say it so publicly, so vulnerably, touched her deeply. She decided she needed to respond not because the public demanded it, but because Keanu deserved to know that his feelings were reciprocated completely. A few days later, she did her own interview. She was warm and open, smiling through her own emotions as she talked about Keanu and what he meant to her. Sandra shared her side of the story, confirming that yes, she'd had a massive crush on him during Speed. She talked about being young and insecure, convinced that someone like Keanu would never be interested in her. She laughed about how they'd both been too shy to make a move, how they'd missed each other completely while everyone around them could see what was happening. But like Keanu, Sandra focused more on what came after. She talked about how Keanu had been more present in her life than people who'd carried more official titles like boyfriend or husband. She described him as her rock, her safe place, her reminder that good people still existed in the world. She said that knowing Keanu was in her life made everything else easier, made the hard times bearable and the good times better. Sandra got emotional when she talked about the kind of love they shared. She said it was the purest love she'd ever experienced because it asked for nothing except mutual care and respect. There was no possession, no jealousy, no games, just two people who genuinely wanted the best for each other and showed up consistently to prove it. She addressed the public's fascination with their relationship directly. She understood why people wanted them to be together romantically. The chemistry was undeniable, the connection obvious, but she wanted people to understand that they were together. just in a way that worked for them. They'd chosen this path consciously, protecting something precious rather than risking it for the possibility of romance. The response to Sandra's interview was equally overwhelming. People loved her honesty, her willingness to be vulnerable, her defense of their unique relationship. Together, Keanu and Sandra had started a conversation about love that went far beyond their personal story. They were challenging people to think differently about what love could look like, how it could show up, how it could sustain us. Other celebrities started speaking up, sharing their own stories of meaningful friendships that defied easy categorization. Therapists and relationship experts weighed in, validating what Keanu and Sandra were describing. There was a growing recognition that society's narrow definitions of love had caused people to undervalue or even dismiss some of the most important relationships in their lives. The world watched as two beloved celebrities, now in their late 50s and early 60s, showed what emotional maturity looked like. They weren't bitter about missed opportunities. They weren't playing games or sending coded messages. They were simply being honest about a relationship that had meant everything to them, even if it didn't look like what people expected. Keanu felt lighter after the interview, like he'd been carrying a secret that wasn't really a secret and had finally put it down. He'd told the truth about Sandra, about what she meant to him, and the world hadn't ended. In fact, people seemed to understand, even celebrate what they'd built together. Sandra felt the same relief. She'd spent years deflecting questions about Keanu, protecting their privacy, keeping their relationship sacred, but there was freedom in finally acknowledging publicly what she'd always known privately. Keanu was one of the great loves of her life, and she didn't need to hide that anymore or apologize for it looking different than expected. They talked on the phone after both interviews had gone viral. The conversation was easy, as all their conversations were. They laughed about becoming relationship gurus in their 60s. They marveled at how their story had resonated with so many people. But mostly they just appreciated each other, grateful that after all these years they could be this honest about what they meant to each other. At 60, Keanu had finally shared his truth about Sandra Bullock. It wasn't a confession of unrequited love or a story of romantic tragedy. It was something better, something deeper. It was a celebration of a love that had transcended expectations, survived decades, and proven that the most meaningful connections don't always need to be romantic to be real. The months following their public revelations brought unexpected changes to both their lives. People approached them differently now, with a kind of reverence for what they represented. They weren't just actors anymore. They'd become symbols of something people desperately wanted to believe in, proof that genuine connection could survive in a world that often felt increasingly disconnected. Keanu noticed it first at a coffee shop in Los Angeles. A woman in her 40s approached him nervously, not asking for an autograph but wanting to thank him. She said his interview about Sandra had helped her understand her own most important friendship, one she'd been questioning because it didn't fit the romantic mold everyone expected. Seeing Keanu honor his relationship with Sandra gave her permission to honor hers. He was touched, realizing their story had reached beyond celebrity gossip into something more meaningful. Sandra experienced similar encounters. At her son's school, another parent pulled her aside to share how the interviews had sparked important conversations in their own family about different types of love. People were examining their relationships differently, valuing friendships more deeply, questioning why romantic love was always positioned as superior to other forms of connection. The media coverage continued for weeks, but it evolved into something neither of them expected. Instead of gossip and speculation, serious think pieces appeared in major publications about redefining love in modern society. Psychologists referenced their relationship in articles about emotional intelligence and mature love. Their story became a teaching moment, a real-world example of people choosing connection over convention. What struck Keanu most was how their honesty had freed something in the culture. People started talking more openly about their own complex relationships, the friendships that felt like more than friendship but weren't romantic. The boundaries that had seemed so rigid began to feel more flexible. Love could be messy and undefined and still be valid, still be important, still be worth celebrating. He thought about this often as his 60th birthday actually arrived. Friends threw him a small celebration, and of course Sandra was there. She walked in carrying a cake she'd made herself, decorated somewhat imperfectly but with obvious care. It was a small gesture, but it represented everything about their relationship. She'd taken time out of her busy schedule to do something personal for him, something that couldn't be delegated to an assistant or bought at a fancy bakery. They stood together on his balcony while the party continued inside, looking out at the Los Angeles skyline. Sandra leaned her head on his shoulder, a gesture so natural between them that neither thought twice about it. They didn't need to talk about the interviews or the public response or any of it. They just stood there, comfortable in the silence, grateful for the moment. Keanu broke the silence first, his voice soft. He thanked her, not just for the cake or for coming to his party, but for everything. For 30 years of showing up, for being constant when everything else was changing. For loving him in a way that asked for nothing except that he be himself. Sandra squeezed his hand and said she should be thanking him for the same things. It was in that moment that Keanu understood what they'd really accomplished. They hadn't just maintained a friendship for 3 decades. They'd created a blueprint for how to love someone sustainably, healthily, genuinely. No possessiveness, no expectations beyond mutual respect and care. No trying to force their connection into a shape that didn't fit. They'd let their relationship be exactly what it was, and in doing so, had built something unbreakable. The party wound down, guests left, and Sandra helped Keanu clean up even though he insisted she didn't need to. This was their dynamic, had always been their dynamic. Showing up for each other in small, consistent ways that accumulated into something profound. She washed dishes while he dried, working in comfortable rhythm. And he thought about how many moments like this they'd shared over the years. In the weeks that followed, both Keanu and Sandra noticed a shift in their own perception of their relationship. Talking about it publicly, naming it, defending it, had somehow made it even more precious. They'd always known what they had was special, but now they understood just how rare it was. Most people searched their whole lives for this kind of connection and never found it. They'd stumbled into it at 30 and had the wisdom to nurture it into something lasting. Their respective partners understood and appreciated this too. Alexandra knew that Sandra held a unique place in Keanu's life, and rather than feeling threatened, she respected it. She'd seen how Sandra brought out certain parts of Keanu that no one else could reach, how their friendship made him a better, happier person. That was something to celebrate, not compete with. Sandra's life was busier than ever, raising her children and managing her career, but Keanu remained a constant presence. Her kids knew him as Uncle Keanu, the guy who showed up with thoughtful gifts and bad jokes, who treated them like real people and listened when they talked. He was family, chosen family, the kind that showed up not out of obligation but out of genuine love. The entertainment industry watched their story with fascination. Young actors would ask them about it in interviews, seeking wisdom about navigating Hollywood without losing yourself. Both Keanu and Sandra would emphasize the importance of surrounding yourself with people who see you as more than your fame, who knew you before you were famous or don't care that you are. They became advocates in their quiet way for redefining success. Success wasn't just about box office numbers or awards or social media followers. Success was having people in your life who truly knew you, who stuck around through the ups and downs, who loved you for who you were rather than what you could do for them. By that measure, both Keanu and Sandra were wildly successful. Time kept moving forward as it does. They celebrated more birthdays, more holidays, more ordinary Tuesdays that somehow became memorable because they spent them together. They watched each other's children grow, supported each other's career choices, mourned each other's losses, and celebrated each other's wins. Their story became the kind that people referenced when trying to explain their own complex relationships. "I have a Keanu and Sandra situation" became shorthand for a connection that defied easy categorization, but was undeniably important. They'd given people language to describe something that had always existed, but hadn't been properly acknowledged. Looking back at everything, at 30 years of friendship and love and choosing each other again and again, both Keanu and Sandra understood something fundamental. The best love stories aren't always the ones that end in marriage. Sometimes the best love stories are the ones where two people see each other clearly, understand each other deeply, and commit to being present in each other's lives without needing to own each other or change each other or make the relationship into something it isn't. They'd missed their romantic moment back in 1994, but maybe that wasn't a missed opportunity at all. Maybe it was a different kind of opportunity, a chance to build something that would last longer than most romances, something that would evolve and grow and adapt to whatever life threw at them. They'd taken that chance, perhaps without even realizing they were doing it, and created a relationship that had become legendary. At 60, Keanu's truth about Sandra was simple but profound. She was his person, his constant, his proof that love came in infinite forms and didn't need to be romantic to be real. She was the friend who became family, the crush that became something better than romance, the connection that survived everything because it was built on genuine care rather than passion or possession. Sandra's truth about Keanu was equally simple. He was the one who showed up, who saw her completely, who loved her without agenda or expectation. He was proof that good people existed, that kindness wasn't weakness, that consistency was its own form of passion. He was her soulmate in the truest sense, the person whose presence made her life better in countless small ways that added up to everything. Their story taught the world something important. That love isn't scarce, it's abundant. That it doesn't have to look one way to be valid. That the most important relationships in our lives might not be the ones we expect, or the ones that fit neatly into societal categories. That choosing to love someone across decades, through changes and challenges, is its own kind of commitment, its own kind of romance. As they both moved further into their 60s, secure in their friendship and the lives they'd built, they carried the quiet satisfaction of people who'd figured out something essential. They'd found each other at the right time, even if it didn't seem like it. They'd built something real in an industry built on illusion. They'd chosen each other every day for 30 years, and that choice had mattered more than any single grand gesture ever could. The truth Keanu shared at 60 wasn't just his truth. It was a universal truth that resonated because it was real. Love is bigger than we think it is. Connection matters more than convention. And sometimes the greatest love story of your life doesn't look anything like what you expected, but it's perfect anyway because it's real, it's yours, and it's exactly what you needed all along. In the end, that was the whole story. Two people who met on a bus that couldn't slow down, who felt something real, who were brave enough to let that feeling evolve into whatever it needed to be rather than forcing it into a predetermined shape. 30 years later, they were still here, still choosing each other, still proving that love in all its forms was the most important thing we'd ever build.